in those spaces, I realized the importance of remaining in these spaces. And then also seeing the beauty of these people who aren't going to let go because the church tells them they have to. And there's a lot of beauty in that, And so I'm doing this work because if I can help just even one person sitting in a pew who's listening to their pastor, even today, there's, people that I do research, obviously, and watch. And as they're talking about these words, they'll say things like, even if you act effeminate, young men, you're sinning. And aren't you lucky to be in this congregation listening to this? If I need to stop that rhetoric,
yes,
and so Christianity is not going anywhere. It's been a part of my entire life. And in order to really create proper change in our society that has real conversations about human sexuality, relationship, biblical interpretation, we're going to all be in trouble.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I stay in this space.
Hi, my name's leowt, and you have found your way to the Conversations podcast. Conversations exist to create spiritually minded conversations about life. We desire to create safe space for dialogue and community. We desire to come together regularly and intentionally to generate conversations about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Everyone is welcome at the conversation.
Hey friends, what's up? This is leowt here with Conversations Official, where we do spiritually minded podcasts about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Today we have a super special guest here, my friend Sharon Rocky Roggio, who is working on the new groundbreaking film 1946, The Mistranslation That Shifted History, about the introduction of the word homosexuality into the Bible. Plot twist, it's not in there originally. And I look forward to hearing Rocky tell us more about this.
I love it. Hey, Leo, how are you?
Good.
It's so good to finally get a chance to talk with you again. Thank you for having me. I always enjoy being on your show.
Absolutely.
The first thing I think I should address is, when is the movie coming out? Because I know that's the big question, and it feels like a long time for everyone, but I guarantee you it's a longer time for me. I started this project alone. I had this idea to do this movie. I had an idea to do a movie first on trying to find affirming ground through theology with my non-affirming family.
Mm-hmm.
And so through my own exploration, I was led to finding affirming spaces, which I know existed, which led me to learn of these two Greek words and the mistranslation. And then my focus turned into Bible translation, specifically this one mistranslation where we have tangible letters from the translation committee pulled at Yale University discussing why they made this decision, proving that it was cultural and not theological. And then there's a man who wrote a letter 60 years ago, who's alive, who's in our documentary. Like, it's just a wonderful story of relationship, but also academics and theology and history and science, and word evaluation. It's just a fascinating piece. But yes, when is the movie coming out? It's been a long time. So we are in technical post-production.
Okay.
And a lot of this stuff takes a really long time, and we're really finessing right now the graphics, words coming out on the page, of the screen, of the letters that they found at Yale. We've got microfilm type footage to play with. We're doing animation sequences. We are just finessing all of that stuff, which does take a little bit of time. So stay tuned for another update in the spring. But we're close. We're closer than we've ever been. We also now have a product to show with a structured piece. We have a full 90-minute movie, right, that we have been submitting to film festivals. We don't know if we're ready to premiere just yet, but the movie is screening really well. People really like it. And so it just helps us be able to fine tune, as I'm saying, as we're finishing. So be patient. Thank you for all your patience and all of your support.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
When it's right, we don't want to force it if it's not ready yet.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. Just as a little sort of side diatribe, I feel like a lot of times when we get queer media, there's this understanding that it's low budget and that we had to scrape together our resources, and it hasn't been the best quality that it could be. So I think just from a production side, it's really important that you're putting all those fine touches in it, because you have a work history in really high level productions, and I think it's great that you're bringing that practicality to this topic, because we don't get that a lot in queer media. So I appreciate the fine tuning.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it'll definitely be worth it. We only get one shot to tell this story.
Right.
Some of the other things that we're adding, though, Leo, I'll let you know a little sneak peek. We have some fantastic scholars in our film that give us another perspective around this debate, that support the findings at Yale University. And some of the feedback that we've been getting is add a little bit more. And so this month, we're going to be interviewing a classicist, a Roman historian, a secular scholar who's going to be able to really break down Corinth and Rome, the Greek.
Yeah.
And really get into
landscape.
Yeah, exactly. Give us a landscape. What was Paul like? What was his company like? What could he have possibly have meant with this word arsenokoitai, which you can't define because there's no definition of it. So what is he talking about there? And he's really going to help break that down. I think his voice is going to be super important. Yeah. And then from there, we found a New Testament Koine Greek scholar who is also a Christian and a theologian. And he is a recent father of twins or triplets, I think now. So we're going to have to go to him. But he's going to be able to also break down the Greek, but also help us learn the translation history. And as a biblical scholar and as a Christian man, be able to, again, answer what's going on with this language. What was Paul meaning? What was this kind of sexual activity that was going on? And is it the same as an orientation? And is it the same as condemning a group of people versus an act? What's this act?
Exactly.
I think it's important to break that stuff down. So it's cool. We're going to add a little bit.
I like that.
More. We're going to pull some out to add some in, but that's okay.
Absolutely. I'm sure the B-roll footage of this will be great too. Like if I could just watch all of that as well, I'm totally down because I'm a nerd. But I like that you're fusing text and context, because that's something that really falls out of modern dialogue a lot. People think they come to the text in a vacuum, but you never do. You come to the text as a 20th century person who let's face it, a lot of the people that are speaking about theology are white German men. You know what I mean? And we lose that nuance. So I'm really excited to fuse the text and the context. Speaking of context, something that we haven't done before is really dive into your context, which I would love to hear a little bit more of your story, because it's very obvious that you have a passion for this project. But I would love to know about like your life, your childhood, when did you know you're gay, growing up in the faith, wrestling with it, like what makes the package of Rocky someone who wants to do this work?
Sure. I think I've been unknowingly preparing to do this my entire life. I always knew that I was different, and I didn't know what different was. I was probably about 5 years old when I realized that I'm not like all the other kids. And what I was noticing were things like, you're pressured at a really young age to get in this societal way of this one man, one woman type playing out everywhere in media, in preschool, and just the way that you get dressed. And so these pressures and these stories I was being shown in the real world didn't fit who I was, and so also on top of being like, who am I going to marry? This Ryan and and just trying to figure that out. My father's a non-denominational minister. And so there's that pressure of not only the gender roles, but this hierarchy and this patriarchal structure, which I still didn't really understand or know anything about, but I didn't fit into as well. And so I was always labeled as a troublemaker because I would question.
Same.
Yes. Right. And then later on, I was like, am I just the troublemaker, or is it more because I'm a woman questioning?
Right.
Because if I were a man, I would be probably deemed a leader.
Yes. Yep.
So it was confusing for me, and it was confusing for my parents, I'm sure.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
And I wasn't easy. I wasn't easy to raise. But for me, growing up, being presented with this internal struggle of not fitting into what society says is proper, normal, natural, whatever words they want to use.
Yeah, right.
Right, exactly. I didn't really respond either to my father's teaching, because I don't really, that binary black and white didn't fit either.
Yeah.
And the reason is what I would hear inside my dad's church, and my dad and my mother and my family, they're lovely people. They live by the word. They're really, they're great people. But, I would always hear things like, we're so fortunate and everybody else is doing it wrong. Even all the other brands of Christianity, even the ones who should be like first cousins.
Right, exactly.
Like, we're not even talking about like extended family. We're talking about
like we should be friends.
Right. And so I saw a problem early on within the church. Fast forward, I'm a teenager. I start realizing, okay, I'm gay. And I'm crushing on girls. You can't hide that. So I start to express it through a diary, but I definitely had a girlfriend. My parents found out. There was a big explosion. My dad read my diary. I left home and I left the church. I never went back because I didn't want to be any part of it. I never fit in anyway, and I just didn't like the division. And it just always felt icky to me. But then fast forward later to 20 years later, I'm living in Los Angeles. I'm now producing and production designing movies. So I'm in the film industry, living my best life. And I meet a woman who tells me she's a Christian. We start dating and she wants to go to church. And I was like, okay, I guess we're going to start going to church, right?
You got to do it for the ladies.
It's always a girl, right?
It's always a girl, always a girl.
See, Dad, there's a plus side there. I don't know. So anyway, so this girl and I start going to church. The girl didn't last, but I had this experience in this church building of feeling othered, really othered for the first time, and understanding even just like not only what goes on for LGBTQ people in that spaces, but beyond that, what's been going on in the church for countless marginalized groups of people. And it really just opened my eyes to bigger problems within our society that stem within our church buildings. And so I started to get vocal. I started to question. I started to be like, hey, I can serve this coffee, but I can't lead this Bible study. Exactly. And the leaders of the church would be like, what do you mean? And I'm like, what do you mean? What do I mean? If you don't know your own bylaws, then that's a bigger problem. I said, or you're lying to me. Because you do know and you just don't want it. They're hiding it from you. So then I ended up doing some investigating, because you build friendships and relationships there. You start to become your friends and your family, and So I really wanted to know. I wanted to know where this church stood. This progressive, liberal LA church. And in the bylaws, they use 3 Clobber Passages, which we'll get into, which are verses that speak against the LGBTQ community. All about marriage, all about, they had some abortion clauses in there, just standard church stuff. But in reading that, I felt like I was going through a breakup because, it's different like in my father's church, where where they stand on the one man, one woman, and how you're really welcome. But then these churches are hiding it from you. And that dishonesty right there, that's where the heartache comes from.
Exactly.
That's what led me to this.
It's like the church of the sexy coffee bar mentality. Like, we're going to be flashy. We're going to have a coffee bar. Our pastor wears Yeezys. We've got a rock band and we got intelligent lights in the background, but we still hate you fundamentally. But we're not going to come out and say we hate you. We're going to make you work for it. Right. And I find that to be so troubling because at this point, you've already acquiesced, you've backpedaled on so many other things that are traditional, but you're still going to hold on to this homophobia. And is really disconcerting to me because it doesn't make sense theologically. So at this point, it's just a bias. Like, let's call it what it is. You're just biased, you know? And there's so many people I talk to on a daily basis that are like, I didn't know my church felt like this. And if anything, it's my job to just point out to people that your church feels like this, right? And I think I really just resonate with that sense of coming back into a progressive space and that being where you felt othered, because that was my experience as well. I came back after I came out, I came into a progressive church space, and that was the first time where I realized I was other, was in this space of progressive, thought. And I think that was what was really disconcerting to me. And it too did open my eyes to that sort of cross boundary, non-binary marginalization, if you will. And we can look at it from our perspective, but it's almost like in coming out, I realized how much I had in common with people who are othered across other boundaries. So I definitely think we're talking about this, but we're also talking about this, and in creating a conversation where we really examine the text and the theology about anti-LGBTQ views. We also get to have a conversation about how other populations have been marginalized as well. But the irony of that is that God was always in the margins. Jesus being born in the manger was the equivalent of Jesus being born in the back alley in a ghetto on a beer case. I'm borrowing that quote from James Cone, a Black liberation theologist, but Jesus is always identified with the margins. So it's time our churches did. But yeah, I'm guessing that's a thing you found out on your own. So
yeah, no, for sure. And I was so far removed from church. Like I said, I didn't even know gay Christians existed.
Right.
I had no idea that all of this work had already been done.
Same. No clue, because I grew up in the realm where biblical inerrancy was it, right? We used to joke at my college that if you actually just whispered the word biblical inerrancy, you would get kicked out. So of course I whispered it 3 times in a mirror and shock and awe when I ended up in a single my senior year. But I grew up in this realm where biblical literalism was it. And I actually think biblical literalism did a violence to the text, because you can't be literal about a text that you don't know the context of. So what was like your kind of background with this idea that did you grow up believing that the Bible could be pushed up against, or was it this sort of thing in a glass case that you couldn't touch?
Well, that's probably why I was labeled as the troublemaker, because I would point out the contradictions or be like, it's so violent, and the violence against women, and, the separation of races, and
justification of slavery, like.
Exactly, and so this idea of another thing too, noticing when Christians will argue biblical inerrancy or literalism, you can't go anywhere with them, because you just go in circles.
Yes.
It's like, well, the Bible says, the Bible says, the Bible says, and it's like you're quoting the source. Like exactly. You need another source, and it's like this, what do they call it? Sola scriptura.
Yep.
And, and it's like, it's just so,
I think
that's so restricting, honestly.
Yeah. I think Martin Luther, when he brought this idea of sola scriptura, really did some violence to the text, because I understand that Martin Luther was trying to break away from harmful things that the early, the Anglican and Catholic churches were doing. I understand that that's what he was trying to do, but he said sola scriptura, but then he made a way for violent anti-Semitism. He made a way for violent anti-LGBTQ rhetoric. He made a way for slaveholders to justify slavery by saying sola scriptura, which literally means only scripture. But the problem is like every reader comes to the text with the context. If you read To Kill a Mockingbird and I read To Kill a Mockingbird, it is going to be so different than if a Black person reads To Kill a Mockingbird. We are going to have different things we bring to the text. And I actually think that's why the Bible is referred to as the living word of God, right? Because it's in that conversation that we realize these truths. And biblical inerrancy and sola scriptura cuts off and truncates the text into this box. But the problem is the box is being defined by the reader, not the writer.
Right. And I never understood any of that. I just never felt like you can't. Well, first of all, again, you can't have a conversation with someone.
You can't. It's just a dead end.
it's a dead end.
Yeah.
And so that was just always very frustrating. But then once I learned of other think leaders and other ways to look at the Bible, and actually, if you look at the Jewish community, they invite a living text. It's constantly living and breathing. What a refreshing way to actually look at things instead of being so restricting,
Yes.
and then controlling. And also it divides, like you said, it gives people permission to do these things, and it's very dangerous. And
Yeah.
so no, we would never, even just knowing that biblical literalism is a modern invention,
It is.
like that, it's like I was today years old, like, it's like they don't teach you these things because they don't want to teach you these things.
No, they don't want an educated populace.
Yeah. And I think like things like your channel and other people who are speaking out is so important.
Yeah.
Because we need to tell our stories, and we need to tell the truth
Yep.
about how the Bible was made, who made it, and who's interpreting it.
Yeah, and let's talk about whose shoulder we were copying over. You brought up Judaism too. Like, I mean, half of the Bible comes from Jewish texts. And it's important to realize that the Old Testament and the Hebrew Bible are different things because things are arranged differently, things are understood differently. Even the ordering of the books in the Tanakh, which is the collection of Hebrew scriptures, right? The ordering of the books are different. The genealogies are different, and those things create a logical change. One of the things I've learned from having the privilege of being in proximity to a lot of great Jewish teachers has been the idea that where there's 2 Jews in a room, there's 5 ideas. And I am really attracted to that idea of Judaism because they're always pushing up against the text in order to understand it better. Like, Jews are still getting new stuff out of a book that predates Christianity by a while, and I actually think that that's cool. And I think that we should borrow from that in Christendom. And I love that that's what your work is doing. Your work is not saying throw out the Bible. Your work is saying let's take it really seriously. And I think that's really, really cool. It would seem like you've come to maybe just progress a little bit beyond sola scriptura, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's way more fun on this side. I mean, come on, let's be honest.
So it's way more fun. And this brings me to a question that I get asked all the time. I've actually taken a great amount of fire for this question, to be honest. My favorite thing to point out is that white people and Black people, Christians and non-Christians, straight and queer, they all hate me with an equal amount. And that is because I refuse to identify in a binary manner. Because I am a queer Christian. And for me to give up either of those things would be to divorce who I am as a person. And you know what? I'm sorry, I had to give up a lot when I've came out 4 times at this point, and I've had to give up a lot for that. I'm not giving up anymore. And so I'm under fire all the time. Like, why would I want to still be a Christian if this is what happens with it? And I'm sure you've gotten that question as well. Like, do you still identify as a Christian? If so, why? If not, why? Tell me a little bit about kind of where you've come with that,
Sure. Well, it's tough because I think Christian is a dirty word sometimes.
Yeah.
And, that's not necessarily our fault. And it's not necessarily most of our oppressors' faults. I think that our oppressors, are our family most of the time, or people we go to school with.
Truthfully.
And I believe that they are victims of bad theology, just like we are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to empathize as much as I can. But for me personally, and going back to church and starting to meet queer Christians and starting to go to the Queer Christian Conference and go to the Reformation Project and meet Justin Lee and meet other people who've written books and meet, people who are on the stage and teaching these things. In those spaces, I realized the importance of remaining in these spaces, and then also seeing the beauty of these people who aren't going to let go because the church tells them they have to. And there's a lot of beauty in that, and so I'm doing this work because if I can help just even one person sitting in a pew who's listening to their pastor even today. There's, people that I do research, obviously, and watch. And as they're talking about these words, they'll say things like, even if you act effeminate, young men, you're sinning. And aren't you lucky to be in this congregation listeing to this? If I need to stop that rhetoric,
Yes.
And so Christianity is not going anywhere. It's been a part of my entire life. And in order to really create proper change in our society that has real conversations about human sexuality, relationship, biblical interpretation, we're going to all be in trouble.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I stay in this space.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way I've come to rationalize it, is like I said, fundamentally, I've already had to give up too much of my life to people or to things or whatever because they thought I couldn't qualify anymore. So at this point, I am just stubbornly not giving up. Sorry, but I think that this is the way I always relate it, right? Like everybody's got that drunk uncle, right? We're out at the county fair, we're out at a street festival, and there's like that family member that, you got to take care of them, because if not, it's going to get wild, right? Christianity is my drunk uncle, right? And if I don't retain a stake in this space, then this space falls to bad theology. And the thing is I'm not willing to let that happen. Now, maybe there's a perfect world where the church is dissolved and we come about being a better institution in society. But the reality is that as a sociological function, the church isn't going anywhere. The church is not just a source of our religion. It's a source of our public aid. It's a source of meeting space. It's a community hub. It's a historical family venture. We're not getting rid of the church. So in my opinion, we have to remedy what's going on in the church that's harmful. Maybe in some perfect world, we could just hit, end record and start again, but that's not where we're at. The church as a sociological institution is staying here. And so if we don't fix it, it's going to get worse. And so I think that's why I'm just stubbornly still here. Like you said, if I can help one person realize that they have a space and that they have a stake and that they have access to this, we've done our job, right? So in many ways, Christianity is my drunk uncle, and I'm the one that's got to come get him. That's how I view it at any rate. So
I think your shirt is perfect. It speaks, yes.
Yeah, shout out to Pastor Adam at Clackamas United Church of Christ. He's a super good friend of mine. He's the guy that posts those sort of viral church signs. He's a fantastic ally in every way, shape, and form. And I think that he does a lot of work too around just reclaiming that institution of the church. He's intersectional. There's Wiccans, atheists, Christians, Catholics, all sorts of folk that come together in this space of his church. And I think that presents a beautiful picture of what this non-binary community of the church should be like, and we start working towards that intermixed, intersectional, non-binary nature by attacking bad theology, which is, the Clobber Passages have absolutely become that sort of thing. So a lot of the focus of your film is these Clobber Passages, and we've said the phrase casually so far in talking about them, but would you like to explain a little bit more what the Clobber Passages are, your understanding of them, and sort of how the film functions in conjunction to them, because they are kind of bedfellows, right?
Sure. Well, so a Clobber Passage would be a verse plucked out of the Bible, out of context, used as a weapon, really, used to attack, to condemn, to judge, not used in a good way. These aren't Bible verses for, daily meditation.
Yeah, they are definitely not
clobber
words. Exactly.
Yeah, because they're hitting you over the head or, beating you with scripture, essentially.
Yep.
And the Bible's been used in many ways, again, for many different groups. Mm-hmm. One example I like to point out is Galileo, who died in jail because there were 5 Clobber Passages that went against his scientific findings.
Yes.
How the earth rotates around the sun.
Yep.
And the church had to apologize to him 500 years later.
Yep, they sure did. After they killed him.
After they killed him, right. And so, another thing I like to say is people are like, you can't challenge 2,000 years of church history. It's like, you better believe we're going to. Yeah, and if you don't, and if you're not challenging it, you're not doing your job. You're not doing society any, you have to challenge the institution.
Yes.
So before we get into the Clobber Passages, one thing I do want to say is our movie is not an attack on Christianity. It's not an attack on God. It's not an attack on anybody's faith. It's not an attack on your mom or your dad or your pastor. This is an intervention about how these verses have been used to justify bigotry, hate, segregation, toward a marginalized, innocent group of people.
Absolutely. I like to say, I read the phrase early on in my coming out, and I wish I could credit the author of this book because I use this phrase all the time, but sorry, citation not available. But I read a quote that said, I take the Bible too seriously to take it literally. And I think that that's exactly where we're at, is people want McDonald's theology, bro. We want diet pills instead of fixing our diets. We want fast news because we don't want to dig in deep. We want memes because we don't want to read. And in that same way, we want fast food because we don't want to have to put the work into nourishing ourselves. And that fast food ideology has filtered over into our theology because we just want to read the book and that's what it says. But you cannot possibly get all the depth that there is to get out of the Bible and out of Christianity if you just look at the words on a page. And so in the assertions that people might say where this is an attack on Christianity, I would counter with, this is an attack on ignorance. This is not an attack on Christianity. I am actually deeply Christian, and at this point, stubbornly. So this is the most deeply spiritual practice that we can be committed to, which is really seeking out and understanding the text, I think. So,
well, and as a marginalized person, and then for us specifically as queer people, we have to do more work. It's easy for anybody who fits into that box to just get that cookie cutter reality and lived in that privileged reality and not have to do any work until you're challenged or someone comes out in your family, and even then people don't do the work because they don't want to believe it. And a lot of it is fear, misinformation, misguidance. And again, that's why I say our families are victims of bad theology, just like we are. Agreed. So I try to empathize as much as I can.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a common crossover here in terms of a discussion to racial justice and, LGBTQ Christians as well, because I had a professor, Dr. Joanne Terrell, pointed out to me that, and I've heard this idea before, but she articulated it so well, that slavery is not just the history of Black people. White people are involved in the history of slavery as well. And I think it's the same way with LGBTQ people, and then sort of, our families, to say it in this sort of colloquial way. But we all have a history at stake here. It's a shared history, whether you're oppressor or oppressed. We are all affected by bad theology, even the people that wield it, right? You're still engaged in that system. And I have to say this. I love my mother. She's a fantastic woman, and we have a great relationship, actually. She did not handle it well when I came out, but this past year, about 12 years after I came out, she actually called me and apologized. I never thought I was going to get an apology, and I love her fantastically for that. And she's been on my podcast since then. But she said, I never didn't love you. I really thought that this was the most loving thing. And I think that that's the danger of toxic theology, is that it can lead you to do unloving things because you're taught that that's what you're supposed to do. So my mom, when I came out, genuinely saw for me a future in eternal conscious torment in hell. And of course, a mother would do anything to save their child from that, And so in that way, we are all victims of toxic theology. And that's what happens when we don't unpack these clobber patches. Is sometimes we end up clobbering people we love. Sometimes we end up clobbering ourselves because we're cutting ourselves off from a relationship with our children, with our community, and that's what this bad theology does. And that's what these clobber passages have come down to.
Yeah, you said it. We clobber ourselves with them too. Sometimes it's horrible.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what are they? So our movie, I think it's really important for us to look at the verses that have been historically used to abuse and weaponize gay people. But our movie is specifically about the mistranslation of one word, homosexual, from two Greek words, malakoi and arsenokoitai, conjoining them to mean this modern term homosexual. And was it theological and cultural, or what was going on there? So that's the thesis of the movie. And so around that, and through the translation history, which I think separates our movie, getting into how we have the Bible that we read today, we have to look at the history of how the word homosexual spread from 1 Corinthians 6:9 through 10, which was the first clobber verse, to other verses throughout the Bible. Now, with these clobber verse history, what we'll be able to show, what Kathy shows in her research, is even when the word homosexual was first put into 1 Corinthians 6:9, it still wasn't historically used as a clobber verse until the 80s. People weren't even really talking about it until the 70s, when it got inserted into all of the other verses. And then what happens in the 70s? We see the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, and then the LGBTQ liberation movement. And the church needs to get a handle of what they call the culture wars. And in that, they start doing things like creating complementarianism. The Nashville Statement is built in the 80s, then the Denver Statement's built later, which are just declarations from the most conservative evangelical groups trying to get a handle on gender roles in society, because they're losing their minds because, hey, guess what? We're queer. We've always been queer, which we'll get into in a minute. And I can't wait to discuss some of the history that gets erased around our queerness and what we're talking about in theology. So with us examining Malachi or Arsenokoitai, which are words probably most people have never heard, unless you're geeks like us.
Right.
And then how, when you take a modern medical term like homosexual, which in the 30s, when they did the work, they didn't understand and considered it a vice. Like the word sodomite, a sodomite is a vice. It's not a homosexual. Correct. A sodomite is not a homosexual. Let's just be honest. Correct. And anybody who says that they are, they're missing out. And you got a lot of work to do.
The whole context.
Okay, right. So we're talking about an aggressive, exploitative act versus condemning a group of people. So that's what our movie focuses on. Now, within that, there's so much to unpack with. There's so much that we can't get in the movie, but we do look at an apologetic of these other verses, which are the two in Leviticus 18, 22, and 20:13. We'll look at Romans 1:26 through 27. And those are primarily the ones. Oh, no, we look at Genesis 19 and Judges 19 too. Okay. We definitely have to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. Right. And then the parallel text in Judges 19 with the same story pretty much. And so these verses, as they've been misunderstood, what we see and we talk about in the film is like, even with the Sodom and Gomorrah story, we see rape culture being perpetuated in our society because we're not dealing with these texts honestly. Correct. I feel as the director of this movie, it's very important to look at the history of how the word entered into these other passages, the spread of it, and then what happens in the 80s, the AIDS epidemic. And now the church has everything that they need to turn the Bible into a weapon against our community.
Yeah, okay.
That's the history of it.
It is. It's 100% true. And that just put together an interesting piece in my brain, because essentially like the seed, right, of this anti-LGBTQ sentiment fell off in the Bible through Arsenokoitai, right? And then it spread, which is interesting because the seed fell in the writing of Paul that took place, in the year of that passage was written. And then they kind of let it filter out into this ancient Jewish text. Like, it doesn't make sense. It's anachronistic, which is one of my favorite words I've learned in school, but it means it's out of chronological order. So literally, homophobia is anachronistic to the text. It's out of chronological order of the way the Bible was constructed. That's interesting to see that spread. And what's great is that you have the receipts for this. You have the scholarly receipts for this. Like, you have got them on hand.
Well, girl, you got it. Everyone's got to show up with the receipts.
You gotta have those.
So I want to know a little bit more about your schooling. Like, I know that you're a biblical scholar yourself. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the things you've learned and where you're going with your education?
I would love to. This is all I do. I eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. And it's funny. I mentioned earlier that I've come out 4 times. So my first time I came out as a lesbian. My second time I came out as a trans man. My third time I came out as non-binary. And my 4th time I came out as a pastor. Because at this point, I came out as a religious person because I had disavowed that part of my life, right? I had pushed it aside and I was convinced I was never going to go back to it because it was so hurtful. And then my wife, she was like, my wife is not a Christian, deeply spiritual, amazing, beautiful, just 10 times more beautiful inside than she is outside, and has always been a staunch supporter of me. Right. And she said, listen, I don't have any skin in the game. I'm not religious, but this is something that you're supposed to do. And once she said that, I reinvented conversations in podcast form. I went into seminary and my life kind of exploded in a way I never realized it could. But to get to that point, you have to realize where I came from. I was assigned female at birth, born into a white conservative Christian family in rural North America, right? In rural northeastern or northwestern North America, right? So Pennsylvania, New York, that's kind of my stomping grounds. And my dad was a pastor. My dad's parents were deacons and elders and stuff. My mom's dad was a pastor. I have family that are missionaries in Africa. And I was the firstborn of my parents. So I have this firstborn nature to like achieve and be the best and follow the rules and do the thing, right? So when I tell people that I drank the Kool-Aid, I didn't just drink the evangelical Kool-Aid, I double fisted the Kool-Aid, right? Like I was so evangelical, I didn't know I was evangelical. In high school, in fourth grade, I was leading CU at the poll rallies, like public prayer. It was a big rally phase that the United States went through in like the early 2000s. That was fourth grade. You know, in 8th, 9th grade, I was starting Bible study at school. I graduated early from high school to pursue a degree in pastoral ministry, was working as a youth pastor throughout my college. I've worked at Assemblies of God churches. I've worked at Christian and Missionary Alliance churches. I was trained and steeped in evangelical doctrine. And that was my whole life. And it was so important to who I was, that when I realized I was gay, it was an instant world shattering, because all of a sudden I had two very dissonant realities in my head. I was a Christian and I was gay. And at that time, there was no mixing of the two for me. And so nothing will make you reevaluate your theology quicker than you realizing you're someone that you thought was going to hell, right? And that's where I came from. And so my first 21 years of life were spent learning conservative theology. If you want to talk about conservative, like the systematic theology textbook that I studied in undergraduate was written by Wayne Grudem, who happens to be a Donald Trump supporter. Like we're talking that kind of conservative. When I was 12, I went to camp, right? And I went to the gift store to buy a gift or to buy something with the money my parents had sent me with. And for an example, my brother Dylan, he bought sea monkeys with his money. And I bought the Fourfold Gospel by A.W. Tozer. I was like 12 and I read it, right? Like I was double fisting. And so when I realized I was gay, it was cataclysmic for me. And it was the moment that started my deconstruction, because I had to do something with this very two different realities. And so after 10 years of kind of just disavowing it, coming out, living out and proud and living my best life, right? I came to the realization that the world needed me because I spoke fluently Christian and gay. And that's when I went back, when I decided to go back and I'm doing a Master's of Arts in Religious Studies with a concentration in interreligious studies with an eye on a PhD in queer theology. And what's been the most important part of that study for me is to realize that what I was taught is such a small slice of the pie. I didn't know that at the time, but had I realized that when I was coming out, maybe I wouldn't have felt so much dissonance. And that's part of the reason I do the work I do today, because I now have an understanding that homophobia is not innate to the text. Racism is not innate to the text. Classism is not innate to the text. If you want to read something in a way, you can read it, and it's in the text in different ways than we've ever thought. Like if you really want to get into the heart of the Bible it's quite anarchistic. You know what I mean? Like the Bible is anti-empire. The Bible is anti-oppressor. Literally, James Cone, who is a Black liberation theologist, said, there is no God if that God does not side with the oppressed. And that's a whole different worldview than I ever got. And so that's what brings me to the text, right? And that's what brings me firmly as a non-binary Christian. And I refuse to relent on any of those, because I exist outside of those categories that I were taught were built into the text. one of the ways in which I've really come to realize that is actually looking back to Judaism, right? Because Christianity draws so much from Judaism, and there's actually an innate understanding of diversity within Judaism. And it goes back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, right? Hillel was a Jewish scholar, and Hillel brought up the ideas of 6 different genders, right? And these are things that are innate in the in the Jewish faith, right? They're grounded historically. This is not a new thing. This is an ancient thing. And in 2006, Rabbi Kukla in 2006 defined these sort of 6 different genders and brought them out. And if we're saying that, if we're to have any integrity with our Christianity, we have to give a nod to the fact that we looked over the shoulders of Judaism. And in Judaism, there was an understanding of the plurality of gender. There was an understanding in that world of different relationship structures, these ideas of monogamy, patriarchy, sexism. Those things are all not in the text originally. At the very least, they're only one, at the very best, they're only one interpretation. And so I just think it's really important that people realize this. And that's why I'm a nerd. Like, let's use it. You know what I mean? Let's bring up those ideas in the text. So,
well, why do you think that, anytime I bring up the 6 genders that are mentioned in the Talmud or any other rabbinic literature outside of the Bible,
yeah.
I'll people come back and say things like, well, that's a queer interpretation or a liberal, like nobody ever talked about it before. Why is this now just coming up again? And, was it hidden? Is there any evidence of that? Do you know anything about that?
I think it's funny because I don't think it was a queer interpretation. I think that our world is built on an idea of compulsory heterosexuality. I'm borrowing that term from a lesbian scholar whose name is escaping me at the moment, but the idea of compulsory heterosexuality is that everything in life has to be filtered through a patriarchal heterosexual lens. And that's not actually the case. So what's funny is people want to say that that's a queer reading. But there's actually not a queer reading, right? You've just assumed that compulsory heterosexuality is the way to view things. But that's not actually the case. You're putting that assumption on the text. This has been there all along. You just didn't know it. Like, you can say what you want, but this reading has always been there. You've just assumed, you've came to the, to the text with your specific lens, and you read it with your specific lens. You never realized your context before going to the text. And that leads to intellectual dishonesty. This stuff has been there. There is rabbinic tradition. I didn't go back and find some papyrus and like pigment and make it myself. Like, this stuff is there historically. So you've missed it because of compulsory heterosexuality that you were taught through your church, through your culture, through your subculture, where all of these things that socialize you have taught you that heterosexuality is compulsory, but it's not. So in engaging in a queer reading, I'm not engaging in anything new. I'm just simply uncovering the queer history that already exists. There is so much LGBTQ and queer history that's been buried. People will work to bury it. Let's talk about David and Jonathan, super gay. Let's talk about Naomi and Ruth, super gay. Let's talk about the idea that there was a disciple who is referred to as the man that Jesus loved, that reclined on his chest. Now, I'm not saying all these people have to be gay, but what I am saying is they could have been, and you can't prove they weren't. So people come to the text with this idea of compulsory heterosexuality, so much so that you're blinded to the actual reality. I just read a quote from an Emily Dickinson letter the other day, which is obviously not canon, but Emily Dickinson wrote a response to a letter she received from a lover. And it said, "I tore the stamp off the envelope and licked it for a remaining taste of you." And people are out here still saying that they were best friends. You know what I mean? And that's an example of the way in which we put the lens of compulsory heterosexuality onto historical queer culture. And so we erase it and we marginalize it. And people do that. They do the same thing to the biblical text as they do to modern examples.
I would think that the literature that talks about the 6 different genders is more concrete and easy to prove than something like the Jonathan and David story and the Ruth and Naomi story, even though the language in the text is highly suggestive. And you're right, you can't prove it either which way.
Right, exactly.
would you agree that this is pretty concrete evidence that for thousands of years we've known about
Oh,
genders?
Oh, absolutely. For thousands of years, like I said, we've got it in the Jewish text. We've got the 6 different categories, which like I could list to you, but I am not a rabbinic scholar, and I would mess up the terms. But I'll drop a link in the show notes here. But the work is done by Rabbi Elliot Kukula, published in 2006. You can find it on the transtorah.org. You can find all of those. So, but also across history, we have had examples of queer people back to antiquity. Actually, the term queer and the term homosexual didn't even exist. So there were queer people that predated the term queer. If you look in Indonesia, if you look in Thailand, if you look in North American indigenous cultures, if you look in Hispanic cultures, if you look in Asian cultures, African cultures, there are queer people who existed outside of the binary from the beginning of time, but their history has just been erased. If you want to find some good resources on that, you can check out Queer Religiosities by Melissa Wilcox. I also have a TikTok where I talk about them, but I list 6 to 8 different examples of queer people that existed within these indigenous cultures that were smothered by colonization. And this, along with those terms in the rabbinic literature, are concrete proof of non-binary existence, right? And I'm using non-binary as an umbrella term that includes ways of relationship too, because if you have a non-binary identity, then you obviously have a non-heterosexual relationship. So
Totally. Have you ever had a conversation with your mom about this stuff?
I have, and my mom, I love the Jill, man. She's great, right? Where I always like to say, where there's a will, there's a Jill. I got a lot of my stubbornness and determination from her. But for her, right? For me coming out, it took me 5 years to say to myself I was gay. And then it took me another year to say to God that I was gay, because that was the 2 forms of internal coming out I had to go through before I could ever publicly say it. So it took me 5-6 years to come out to myself. And after that coming out period, I think it took my mom another 5 to 6 years to realize I was gay, right? And so now we're on a trajectory, and she's a little bit further behind me, but she is firmly committed to loving me. And so she doesn't understand the gender thing necessarily yet. But what is funny is that she understands my personality, right? And she knows that I've always been this person, but for her, she hasn't yet cognitively connected it to sort of a dissolution of the binary. And so we exist in a tension, that is real and that is valid. But yeah, I think that our love for each other surpasses that. And I think that's something that's important to know, is that you can have a relationship based on love amidst tension, because I am hardline about who I am as a person, and I'm not going to truncate that when I'm around my mom, and she's hardline about loving me. And so sometimes she calls me she. At this point, it's funnier for her than it is for me, because I got a dope beard, but we do exist in that tension. She doesn't quite understand it, but she's also not mired down in the scholarship of it. She's more just living her life and committed to loving me. And I feel that by existing in my own authenticity, it helps open her worldview and the worldview of people who I'm around. So it's been a long journey, honestly, fraught with a lot of counseling. For both my mom and myself, we've both done counseling individually, and I respect her for that work. I just think she's a little bit further behind on my trajectory, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I can imagine.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Let's talk about the 1946 movie from and dealing with the word homosexual. How do we expand this to more than just one word, and it's more than one group of people? Like, do you have any insight for me as a director on how I can make sure to tell this story in a way that it doesn't exclude anyone?
Yeah, absolutely, because this is the key, that a threat to or injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so engaging in the path of setting out to right this historical manipulation and wrong, because it is a historical wrong, when we right this wrong, we tip the scales of justice in the right direction. And so when we prove that we can approach the text with boldness and authenticity, we prove that this text can be approached on other issues as well. So we're having a conversation about the word homosexuality, but really what we're having a conversation about is authentic scholarly study and coming to the text in an authentic way. And I think that when we free the text from the hands of the oppressor in any way, it becomes looser in every other way. And so for me, I see a struggle for a reclamation of the text. I see that struggle as representative of a reclamation of the text for all people. And that means queer people, and that means women, and that means brown people, and that means, that means interreligious identity. All of those things are wrapped up together, right? If you look at queer theory, it comes from a basis, it has its history. If you work backwards, we've got queer theory, we've got womanist theory, we've got feminist theory, we've got liberation theory. And all of those things are tied up together. And liberation theory actually comes out of Latin America. And all of these things build together to get us to a point of intersectional justice. And so I think by coming in here and looking at the word homosexuality, you're freeing the text from the hands of the oppressor. And I think that creates an intersectional mindset. Certainly one of the best ways you can just say is, if this has been read onto the text, what else has been read onto the text? And you create an open-ended conversation by asking an open-ended question. So in this way, you're having a conversation about homosexuality, but when you free the text from that oppressive mindset, people are suddenly able to look at the text in a new way in regards to a lot of things. And so I think in that way, the struggle for justice is tied up together, right? Like James Cone said, there is no God unless he sides with the oppressed. So who are the oppressed? The gays, right? The disabled. We don't talk about ableism enough at all. But when we start to talk about how there's a clear pattern of ableism and healing, and how our church looks at, well, if you're sick, you must be evil. We've got to combat that. But when we start to combat bad interpretations about homosexuality, we free ourselves to talk about ableism. We free ourselves to talk about classism, all those things. And so I think in starting the conversation, you get to say, I'm just starting it. I'm not closing it. I'm creating an open-ended environment where we ask more of the text than has been asked before.
I love that. I love that. Well, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add to the interview, or anything else we wanted to talk about.
I really like you, and I really like this topic, so we could talk for a long ass time. I held in all my swears till this moment, so you had good footage to use with no swears. I was like scholarly Leo, and then I said the word ass. But no, I think you're doing really, really important work. And I see your work as part of, like I said, that open-ended question. And I think in asking more of the text, you create an environment where everybody can come to it and see themselves represented. There are so many scholars. And I think if there's one thing I could say to people, is that there are so many scholars that have been holding the text to a higher standard for a very long time. And the thing is they just weren't straight, white, cisgendered American land-owning men. So I would encourage people, if you think this is a hoax, do your research. Because nothing makes you do your research more than being told you're going to hell. Nothing, right? And one of my favorite things is when people say like, oh, well, you should read the Bible. And I'm like, which language? I've read it in 4 or 5. Man, I have a stack of books right back here just off camera, and it is actually like 10 Bibles. And I've read them all. And so I'm not saying I'm the be all end all, but I'm saying my opinion is absolutely as valid. And I think that I guess on that note, what I would say is you don't have to have all the answers, but you need to be willing to live in the questions. It took me 10 years to realize that I still wanted to even claim the word Christian, and I still add the word reluctantly Christian in front of it, But one of the best pieces of advice I've ever been given is you can't stop living until you have an answer. You have to live with the question. Right now, you're posing a fantastically huge question, which is, why did we ever suppose this compulsory heterosexuality onto the text, right? And we might not have an answer to that for a long time, but as we pick apart those pieces, we can find new life. And you don't have to wait till you have an answer to live. You can start living right now. I didn't know it was okay to be gay right away. I just knew I was. And I started living into that question. And here I am over a decade later, finally coming back and reclaiming my heritage. And as a queer person of faith, it's not easy to retain your heritage, but I am stubborn enough to stand here publicly and say, it's mine. Good, bad, or indifferent, drunk uncle or not, this is my heritage, and I'm here for it. And I think that when we live into those questions and when we live into those questions publicly, we create space for other people to exist. And I think that what you're doing is a very important work because you're creating space for all sorts of people to exist. Sure, we're talking about the word homosexuality, but the disabled, non-English speaking refugee now has more ability to exist in a space where they can question the patriarchal assertions of the text, and so I think that's a very, very important work, and it's scholarly grounded, and moreover, it's an apologetic, but it's moving us to the place where we can move beyond apologetic, because I don't need an apologetic to be queer, I just am. But
100%. Yeah,
to get to that place, we have to start to dismantle some logical structures. And so I don't need apologetics anymore because I just exist, and that's a beautiful thing. But I think intellectually, to get to that space where we don't need apologetics, we have to encounter them. And so I think you're doing that really, really, really fundamental work of dismantling systems of oppression. And for that, I thank you so much.
oh good, thank you. Yeah, that was a tough choice because it's like, do we really want to focus on that? But I do think it's really important because we see the spread of the words, and like you said, going backwards, putting the homosexual into the Levitical passages. I think that we have to get to the fundamentals of it. So
we do. Yep. And so you're talking about this, but you're not saying I'm only talking about this. And I think that's the thing, is like, justice isn't pie, right? It's not like when you take your slice of justice for LGBTQ people, there's less for Black people or disabled people or poor people. No, you're actually creating an expansive environment where all of these other groups and peoples can have a voice in the text as well. And so I know it's in a non-binary world where we're trying to keep our head on a swivel for equal justice everywhere, it feels like a little bit worrisome to focus on one area of study. But I think that your area of study is creating a more approachable text. And I think that that's a beautiful thing.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, because there's only so much you can put in a 90-minute film.
Right.
The thesis is a lot to talk about within itself. So yes, we're just trying to plant seeds within this one intervention that does expand to welcome and liberate everyone.
Exactly.
But we have to pull from, this one tangible piece of evidence that we've pulled from Yale to hopefully then have everyone want to engage in a broader conversation for many, many years to come.
Exactly. And I love that you're it's not like you got some podunk Christian college that's existed for 80 years. You're like going to Yale, you're going out there, you're doing the thing. You've got biblical scholars from all stripes. And I think that that's fantastic because, like I said, we don't need apologetics to exist because we are obviously hearing queer, right? But I will attack that apologetics any and every day because they've been wielded against me.
Right.
That's the work that we do. So, Rocky, I have to thank you so incredibly much. I could talk to you all day because I feel like we just have so many parallels here in our stories, not the least of which being people who were assigned female at birth and also born with a brain, because we were not taught that those things could coincide. And look at us, I've got a beard and you've got a movie career, and we're here.
I love it.
I love it.
We're not going anywhere.
Yeah, no, we're not going anywhere. No, we're not going anywhere. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this is project one and a lot bigger of a conversation. And I'm really excited to see what comes of this movie. I'm just saying, like, if we got premiere tickets, I'm down to throw some cash on them. I'm saying however we can collaborate, I am here for it. And I have to thank you for the service that you're doing in the world, because I know because of my own story that it's born out of a lot of personal trauma, and it takes a lot of healing to come to this place. So thank you for the internal work you've done to be able to be this person for so many people.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon, Rocky. You have a great day. Everybody else, this has been Conversations. This has also been a conversation about 1946, which, if you can help in any way, shape, or form, monetarily, promotion, any of that, Rocky, how can folks help you out with this work? Is there any people can help?
Yeah, the best way to help us, just follow us first. Follow us on social media on all platforms at 1946 the movie. And then if you wanted to learn more, you can go to our website, 1946themovie.com. We do have a GoFundMe up if you wanted to support us. We also have a fiscal sponsor, so you can make a tax-deductible donation through Women Make Movies. Awesome. Or if you wanted to help support us, you can buy merch. There's a merch link on there. But like I said, if you don't have finances to help, no problem. Just share our content, follow us on social media. We really appreciate the support, and just be patient. We'll get it out as soon as we can.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate the diligence. Honestly, I'd love to see it yesterday, but I realize that as these things unfold, from the sounds of it, you've just found more and more and more threads to pull on, which I actually think is great because it strengthens the argument every way, shape, or form. So
exactly. And some of the feedback, right, we've been implementing. So thank you. I appreciate that.
I love that. I love that's part of being able to be flexible and like we're learning as we go. And I think that attitude of humility is going to take the film a long way. So I thank you so much, Rocky. I look forward to support the film in any way. I can't wait to see it. And I look forward to chatting with you again. Have a great day. Bye.
All right, don't hit stop yet.
Okay.
Big favor. Do the opening again, but can you say my first name, my Rocky name, and then say Roggio with a long
Roggio, I'm sorry.
That's okay, because I might want to use the opening to say, we're conversations. I'm talking with Sharon Rocky Roggio. That's it. Okay, great.
Hey friends, what's up? This is leowt here with Conversations Official, where we do spiritually minded podcasts about life, belief, and the intersection of the two. Today we have a super special guest here, my friend Sharon Rocky Roggio, who is working on the new groundbreaking film 1946, The Mistranslation That Shifted History, about the introduction of the word homosexuality into the Bible. Plot twist, it's not in there originally. And I look forward to hearing Rocky tell us more about it.
This has been the Conversations Podcast. Thank you so much for joining. If you have any questions or comments, or just want to get involved, feel free to join the conversation on social media. You can find us at Conversations Official on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And please don't forget to rate, follow, and share this podcast. We're available on Anchor, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for joining the conversation.